Okay, welcome. This is a course about the Pesher haVakuk min haMegillot haMelach. In ordinary language, the haVakuk Pesher in the scrolls from the Sea of Salt. In more popular language, the haVakuk Pesher amongst the Dead Sea Scrolls. Okay, so the haVakuk Pesher was found among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Khirbet Qumran by the Sea of Salt, and it was found in cave number 1. That's why it's in it's 1Q. So the scientific designation for this manuscript is 1Q Pesher haVakuk. Okay, the spelling that I'm using here, you may find it unusual if you're not used to more academic transliterations of Hebrew. It's a deep H. This is the Hebrew word het, not het. It's het. So it's a deep H, similar to the way that similar letters are pronounced, for example, in Arabic. Okay, so let's have a look at the Pesher haVakuk. Okay, this is not only a dry academic lecture. We're going to sort of try to show certain things and come to conclusions that will impact people's lives. Good. Here are some pictures, some photographs of the Qumran area. And these are the ruins, and these are the caves. That you can see one of the caves there is very clearly seen. There. Okay, so this is by the Dead Sea in Eretz Yisrael. It's about close to 400 meters under sea level. So one of the advantages there is that there's a lot of atmosphere between you and the sun, and it could be extremely hot there, but the ultraviolet radiation is fairly mild. So you can overheat and suffer from heat stroke very easily if you work there in summertime. But you know, being burned by the sun is not the primary issue, because tanning for people with lighter skins, it's very mild there. Okay, so the translation on which this is based is that by Professor Robert Eisenman and Professor Michael Wise, and I've added transliterations as well as a commentary. Okay, so over here you can see my name, you can see my email address, and then you can also see the last date that I worked on this guy. Okay, so let's jump in and start over here. Okay, so the book of haVakuk is one of the 12 short prophetic texts in the Tanakh. In the Dead Sea Scrolls there was found a Pesher, a commentary on the first 2 chapters of the book of haVakuk. We've talked about it being designated 1Q Pesher haVakuk. Okay, so what we're going to do, in chapter 3 of this work, we're going to present Pesher haVakuk with no footnotes or any commentary. In chapter 4, the Pesher is going to be repeated with annotated footnotes as well as a commentary. Then there's some final expository comments presented in chapter 5. Okay, there's also some assignments that will guide the reader to ask penetrating questions and find important answers. Righto, so surprise, surprise, to be able to comprehend and to understand Pesher haVakuk, we'll need to go into what is known as the Jesus movement. Specifically, we've got to look at Yaakov haTzadiq, James the Just, the high priest of the purest Sadducite Zealot opposition. Okay, so what you had in ancient Israel is that starting in about 200 BC, there was concerted efforts by the Seleucid rulers, specifically by what the fractured empire started by Alexander the Great, that fractured into 4 different regions, and basically the people of Israel, the Yehudim, they had most of their issues they had with the Syrian Seleucids, because the Seleucid rulers wanted to aggressively Hellenize Israel. So there was a Maccabean revolt, which is a different story. Suffice to say that there were 2 major, there were a couple of major groups. First of all, there was the Hellenizers. These were Jewish people who said, let's forget this Torah stuff and this Moses stuff and all those traditions. Let us become modern and become just like the Greeks, and let us Hellenize and slaughter pigs and have competitions in gymnasiums, in athletic competitions without wearing any clothes. That is what is known as gymnasiums. And so these were the Hellenizers. And then there was the Maccabean civil wars, basically between the Hellenizers and the traditionalists, who stayed faithful to the Torah of Moses and the ancient traditions of the people of Israel. Okay, so the opposition split into 2 groups, two main groups around, let's say, the year 160, 150 or so. There were 2 groups. There was the Perushim, the Pharisees. The Pharisees can be called disciples of Jeremiah, Talmudim of Yirmiyahu Hanavi. Now, why on earth do I say that? If you read the book of Yirmiyahu, if you read that book, the prophet says over and over again, don't fight against the Babylonians, cooperate with them. In the end of days, things are going to be sorted out. Hashem will intervene at the Ketz Yamim, in the Acharit Yamim, and then there's 2 chapters, chapters 50 and 51 of the book of Yirmiyahu, dealing with the eventual fall of Babylon. But basically the prophet said, don't fight now, you're going to get hurt, you're going to get seriously hurt. Just cooperate with the Babylonians and you'll be able to strike a deal where you can continue with your ancestral faith, and they will give you the liberty for that. There is a path of cooperation as possible. So when it was clear around the year 150 BCE that the Greeks were on their way out and Rome was ascending to be the dominant world power at that stage. Just have a sip of coffee here. The Pharisee says, let's do what the prophet Yirmiyahu taught us. Let's negotiate deals with the Romans. Let us cooperate with them. Let us and we trust that they will let us continue with our Torah observance. Okay, so that was the attitude of the Perushim. So that was a Roman collaborationist political party. On the one hand, quite strict with Torah observance, but in terms of international relationships, they said, let's go for minimum collateral damage. Let's strike a political deal with them, and we are a minor power, they are a major power. Let's not try to fight for our independence. Let us work with the Romans. Then there was what was later called in terms of purist Tzadoqim. Okay, so in Hebrew there is a letter. It's usually called the Tzadeh. but it's actually the correct Hebrew way of saying it is Sadeh. So it's not a TZ sound, it's a deep S. But it's difficult on the tongue, so very often I will even say Tzaddik and so forth, but it's Sadiq, not Tzaddik. Okay, so the purest Tzadoqim said, we want to be independent. These Romans are godless pagans, and we don't want them to rule over us because they are kind of like disgusting in their pagan habits and so forth. So the purists said, no, we're not going to work with these people. We want to be independent. We want to have a rulership of our own, be it a Maccabean rulership or, in the ideal case, a Davidic rulership. Okay, so these were the two major groups. And most of the Hasmoneans, Maccabees, were aligned with the purist Tzadoqim, but some of them also aligned themselves. You know, there was maybe a 10-20 year period when the Perushim would be dominant. Don't see these as rival religious groups. The difference between them is that the one group was a collaborationist group, being the Perushim, the Pharisees, and the other group was an independence-minded group who said all this tax that we pay to the Romans, it's terrible. It's a slap in our face. We don't want to pay this tax, and we don't want them and their armies in our country because they sort of like it's a contaminating presence. Okay, so in this time arose movements. Around the year 6 CE, there was the governor in Syria was Quirinius, and he took instruction from Caesar Augustus, Caesar Octavianus, to sort of have a census and to have a property registration census. During property registration census, just a little side note, you didn't travel to your ancestral hometown, as we are told, for example, in the book of Luke. No, you were counted in the town where you lived. If you lived in that Nazareth area, you were counted over there. And just a little other note is that there were two Bethlehems in ancient Israel. There was one Bethlehem about 10 odd kilometers from the Nazareth area, and then there was another Bethlehem about 210, 220 or so kilometers way down to the south. So basically it was extremely near from the ancient Nazareth area to the Bethlehem of Galilee. The Bethlehem in Yehuda was way far from that and so forth. Anyway, so during this time there was the census, and then there was revolt under Yehuda HaGalili, Judas the Galilean, and he had a collaborator known as Tzadok the priest, Tzadok HaKohen. Okay, so there was a bitter fighting there, and it was a time, especially in the Galilee, it was a time of resistance. There were towns like Kohava and Natsara and so forth. So if you know, for example, the Hebrew of the book of Bamidbar, the book of Numbers, Sefer HaPekudim. In Sefer HaPekudim, the book of Numbers, also known as Sefer Bamidbar, there is a prophecy. It's known as the world ruler prophecy or the star prophecy. And in the star prophecy, it talks about the Kohav, the star will come out of Yaakov and will batter the brows of the opponent. So that was seen especially by the independence-minded apocalyptic revolutionaries of that time as what is known as the world ruler prophecy. So if you saw, for example, in ancient Galilee, maybe on the other side of the Jordan River, that there were towns like Kohawa. The town Kohawa means it's a reference to the star prophecy of Bamidbar 20:24. It's a town name that means we want independence. We don't want to be under Roman rule. We want to be the dominant power. We want to at least rule ourselves, and we believe that a leader is going to come forth from our people who's going to rule the world. And that person was seen as an anointed person, and was meant to be was also known as Moshiach. In the Hebrew scriptures, if you read the Hebrew Tanakh, what is sadly known as the Old Testament, it's a misnomer. If you read the prophetic books of the Tanakh, Mashiach is a nameless, vague person with a very specific job description. Basically, what the prophets are saying is that the leadership of Israel have done very badly. 90+% of the kings were not very good. Were underperformed, and for that reason there is a prophetic hope that the Almighty will, in days to come, in the Acharit Yamim, in the coming days, there's going to be like an intervention in some other manner, and a ruler will arise from Israel who is going to be utterly selfless, strict, and extremely wise, and 7 facets of the anointing of haMelach HaMashiach are, for example, mentioned in the book of Yeshayahu, known as Isaiah. It's Yeshayahu, Perek 11. Okay, so in chapter 11 of the book of Yeshayahu, there's the 7 facets of anointing of the coming leader. In Yechezkel chapter 34, the historical failure, and also in chapter 37, the historical failure of the kings of Yehuda are contrasted, of the kings of Israel, the kings of Judah, is laid out. They were worried about their own, in our language, bank accounts, their own riches, and their own pomp, and their own egos, and they were not really there for the benefit of the people. And so in this context, it is said that Avdi David, my servant David, will be sent by Hashem, and that he is going to be a Ro'eh Tov, is going to be a selfless leader, a good shepherd, not there for his own wealth, but to sort of bind up the little sheep with broken bones and so forth. Okay, so it's in this context that there arose these independence, apocalyptic, revolutionary movements in Yehuda, in the land of Yehuda, the southern part, as well as especially in the Galil, in the more northern parts. And amongst these apocalyptic revolutionary groups who believed that the corrupt Herodian rulership, who were not very moral, they were immoral, and they were quite cruel. And also the Roman overlords would be driven out of the land, and that a Davidic king would once again rule over the land. And the so-called Jesus movement was part of these apocalyptic revolutionary movements. Revolution in the sense of a complete change of a society, so that a new world order would come into being, where the good people would rule and the bad people, the pagan, immoral people, they would be ousted and they would lose their power. And okay, so after the execution of Jesus, when he got on the wrong side of the law, it appeared that just before Passover, in the year of his death, he invaded the Beit HaMikdash temple mountain in a sort of paramilitary way, and they sort of like dealt with undesirable elements being present there, and then they stationed armed guards at the entrances, and basically for a couple of days, at least a day, maybe more than one day, there was like a mini coup d'etat of the Temple Mountain, for the sake of purity, to drive out the. What you had at that stage is that the elite priests, the establishment Tzadoqim, Sadducees, they were appointed, and the offices were like handed out by the Romans and by the Herodians. And it was a club of rich people, very much concerned with money and riches and things like this. So it wasn't a pure high priesthood. It was a highly compromised, Romanized, Herodian, compromised sort of a high priesthood that ruled. So the Tzadoqim, the purest Tzadoqim, Zealots, they did not want this. They were extremely upset and emotional about this. So what was done that the information in the Gospels, and this will come out during the course of these lectures. The information in the Gospels is a pacification attempt to create a passive, kind of a inward focused mystery religion. It is psychological warfare against the Jesus movement that you've got in the so-called Gospels. Not uniformly present, but quite strongly present. And the peak of this psychological warfare is, in a sense, found in the book of Acts. This is a thing that will come out during the course of these lectures. Okay, so there was a chronicler, Josephus, lived from about 110 to 180. He's quoted by Eusebius in the Historia Ecclesiasticus, in the history of the church. He wrote as follows about Yaakov. Yaakov haTzadiq, James the righteous, the brother of Jesus. Okay, so there's a reference. And Eusebius is saying, Yaakov, the brother of a master, succeeded to the government of assembly in conjunction with the shliachim, with the apostles. He had been called the just, Hebrew tzaddik, Latin justice, by all from the time of the master to the present day. He was set apart, he was consecrated, he was made kodesh from his mother's womb, and he drank no wine or strong drink, nor did he eat meat. No razor came upon his head. He did not anoint himself with oil, and he never used any Greco-Roman public bathhouses. He alone, without anyone else being present with him, entered into the Kodesh Kodeshim, the Holy of Holies, of a temple in Jerusalem. For he wore not woolen, but white linen garments. And he was in the habit of entering alone into the temple, and was found upon his knees, begging for the forgiveness for the people, so that his knees became calloused like that of a camel, in consequence of his constant kneeling on his knees in the avodah of Hashem and asking forgiveness for the people, because of his exceeding great tzedaqah, justice or righteousness. Tzedaqah has got to do with social justice. He was called Oblias, which means pillar and bulwark of a people. It's also called the Tzaddik, in accordance with what the prophets declare concerning him. Okay, so this account was written about 90 or so years after the death, the sort of murder of Yaakov haTzadiq in the year 62 CE. He's presented as a man of great devotion to the Almighty and very zealous for the Torah of Moshe. He entered into the Holy of Holies of a temple, and even into the Kodesh Kodeshim, the Holy of Holies, specifically on a Yom Kippur, evidently as the opposition high priest, the Kohen Hagdol of the purest Tzadoqim, performing a prayer service on behalf of a nation on the Day of Atonement. Okay, now normally, something like this, there being not only a primary high priest, but an opposition high priest, this would be outrageous. But if a high priesthood is so compromised that you see that, it's a bunch of gangsters who have become high priests, and it's people with a demeanor and the way in the world is simply that you can't have any respect for that. This is when radical steps were taken historically by the opposition, by the pious opposition, the Hasidim, to put a high priest of their own, of sufficient holiness and purity, to let him perform the avodah in the Kodesh Kodeshim on Yom Kippur, in the Beit HaMikdash, in the Temple Mountain. Okay, so if you read, for example, the book of Leviticus chapter 16, you will know that it was only the Kohen Hagadol, only the high priest, who was allowed to enter into the Kodesh Kodeshim, the Holy of Holies, and only once a year, namely on the 10th of Tishrei, on the day of Yom Kippur. Okay, so it's very clear that Yaakov haTzadiq, according to what we have here, he functioned as a high priest, and he went into the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur, and he was dressed in linen and not wool, as would behove a high priest. That is the garments that had to be worn by the high priest. Okay, so just a little note here. You'll see that I spell the Leviticus with a W. It's not a typo. It's the Hebrew letter Waw, mispronounced popularly as Vav. It's Waw. Okay, so that is a deeper sound. It's not Leviticus. It is not a vet. It is the Hebrew letter Waw. Okay, so that is why David is also written like that. Okay, so all right, so in Leviticus 16 we read about the entry into the Holy of Holies. It's the day when Kippur, atonement, covering of sins are made, and the high priest had to wear linen garments. It's an everlasting chok, statute for you, that Kippur, covering of sins, may be made for the Am Yisrael once in the year, specifically on Yom Kippur, Yom haKippurim, because of all their sins. Okay, so in the late Second Temple period, under the Herodians, the ordinary people of Israel detested and distrusted the establishment high priests. In particular, the house of Ananus, Beit Hanan, the official mafia-style pro-Roman, gangster-like, pro-Herodian establishment high priests. The hatred of a majority of the Israelites toward the Herodian-appointed high priests, high priestly dynasties, which began to rule when Herod the Terrible, not Herod the Great, Herod the Terrible, imported Boethus as high priest from Egypt and married his daughter Mariamne, is seen in the words of Abba Shaul ben Banit, who lived in the city of Jerusalem around the year 40 CE. The house of Boethus heads the list of wicked priestly families enumerated by Abba Shaul. Tractate Pesachim 57a of Gemara quotes a poem of woes composed by Abba Shaul, which criticizes the Boethusian high priests, who were put in charge of the Beit HaMikdash in Jerusalem by the Romans through their Herodian puppet rulers. Woe to me because of the house of Boethus. Woe to me because of their battens. Woe to me because of the house of Hanan, Beit Hanan. Woe to me because of their whisperings. Woe to me because of the house of Katros. Woe to me because of their pens. Woe is me because of the house of Ishmael ben Fabi. Woe to me because of their fists. For they are the high priests, and their sons are the temple treasurers, and their sons-in-law are the temple trustees, and their hired servant acting as private gangster militia bully boys beat the people with batons. Okay, so woe to the country who have fallen in a state where people like this have become the high priests. This is terrible. There's a massive alienation between the people at large and their elite high priests. Okay, it's alienation that calls for insurrection, and so this is why the first century was a time of insurrection. Round about between the year 170 BCE and the year 134 CE, there was like at least 60 plus uprisings and three major wars by the by the independence parties and by just people who were totally disgusted with the immorality of rulers, of ruling classes. And so it was a time of insurrection. So what we've got in the Gospels is that this is like tuned down, it's hidden, because the Gospels are written with a permission and maybe partly even with a guidance and under the censorship of the Romans. And so what you should view the Gospels as a type of pacification literature to take this religion that was uncompromising and that was told the people that, listen, you must have a Davidic ruler. You can't have foreign rulers. It's not the will of Hashem, but you will always have foreign rulers over you. And ultimately, there must be a liberation event, Geula Shalama, and you must have your own Davidic king ruling over you. So there was this religion that was inherently freedom-minded. Now, the Torah given to Moses says that Hashem says that the land belongs to me. And here comes the Romans, here comes the Herodians, and they say, no, the land belongs to us. And we will tax the population to an extent where it becomes an unbearably high tax. If you want to walk on a road, you will be taxed. If you want to enter a city, you will be taxed. Everywhere you find these tax collectors, you find these toll roads, so to speak. And so this was a time of insurrection. This was a time of alienation of the ordinary people from the class of collaborating elites that enriched themselves by cooperating with the Romans as well as the Herodians. Okay, so many, if not most of the Israelites would have viewed Yaakov haTzadiq as the real morally superior opposition high priest of Israel, and only trusted the efficacy of a Kippur, the atonement made by the Tzaddiq's avodah, as the people's high priest. Now, one of the things that will come out, you should not view these guys like Yaakov haTzadiq as Christians. Christian, as the term is used today, is just not what these people were. They were Torah-observant Jews, and they were messianists in the sense that they said that we want our own ruler from our own people to rule over us. And they were expecting and wanting an anointed ruler, haMelach HaMashiach. Okay, at this stage, it must also be pointed out that the later Pauline concept of saying that you must believe that a certain person is the Mashiach, and if you don't believe that, blah, 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 it's bad news, and, you know, that is alien nonsense. It is absolute nonsense. In the Tanakh, in the Hebrew scriptures, You trust Hashem, and you lead a decent life, and your works go before you. If, let's say that you are in the USA, and you say that today we don't have good leadership, but in the future we want to have good leadership, that is sane. If you say that like 20 years in the future there will come a guy and his name will be John Smith, and if you don't believe that John Smith is the anointed leader, you're going to burn in hell. That would like be crossing the line to insanity, to being absolutely certifiably mad. Okay, so saying that you must believe that a certain person is Mashiach, and if not, you are under the wrath of God, is certifiable madness. It is absolute nonsense. Okay, so righto. So Yaakov's abstaining from wine and not shaving his head indicates that he was following the Nazarite rules as laid out in Numbers 6, Bamidbar 6. Okay, so there were Nazarites who abstained from one strong drink, and they also didn't sort of go for regular haircuts and so forth. While the person was under the Nazarite vow, no razor shall come upon the head. Okay, John Painter states that Yaakov's abstention from anointing himself with oil and not taking public baths indicates a complete rejection of Greco-Roman Gentile ways, with their public baths and perfumed oils. Jerome, the so-called church father Jerome, basing his account on that of Josephus, Clement of Alexandria, as well as the Jewish historian Josephus, Joseph Bar Matai, also knows this when he says in his Lives of Illustrious Men, chapter 2, that Yaakov haTzadiq, James the Just, alone enjoyed the privilege of entering the Holy of Holies in the temple in Jerusalem. Indeed, he did not wear woolen but only white linen clothes, and went into the temple alone and prayed on behalf of the people, so that his knees were reputed to have acquired the callousness of a camel's knees. Epiphanius also quoted these works, plus maybe some additional material in Panarion. Okay, just for a little side note here, the word Panarion basically means a little box in which you put your medication, in which you've got your pills and your ointments and stuff like this. So he was writing against heresies, and so he called his work Panarion, which means that these are the medicines against the heretics and so forth. Anyway, so Epiphanius writes as follows: To Yaakov alone it was allowed to enter once a year into the Kodesh Kodeshim, the Holy of Holies, of a Beit HaMikdash, of a temple in Jerusalem, because he was a Nazarite and he was connected to the priesthood. James was a distinguished member of a Qana'im, of a priesthood, because the two tribes, the priestly tribe Levi, not Levi, Levi, and the royal tribe Yehuda were linked to one another, the royal tribe to the priestly tribe. Okay, so we see Yaakov haTzadiq as a zealous and devout adherent to the Torah of Moshe, who intercedes in extended, intense prayer inside the Kodesh Kodeshim, the Holy of Holies of the Beit HaMikdash in Jerusalem, for the forgiveness of the sins of his people. Yisrael, a high priest could only enter the Kodesh Kodeshim once a year on Yom Kippur. The extant traditions depict Yaakov haTzadiq acting as opposition high priest of Israel in a Yom Kippur prayer service inside the Holy of Holies in the Heichal, the central building in the temple. By acting as the popular opposition high priest, Yaakov haTzadiq must have incurred the intense hatred of Beit Hanan, the house of Ananus, the official Herodian-appointed lineage of high priest. The message to the house of Hanan was essentially, you, the officially appointed rich, elite high priests, are hopelessly corrupt and unrighteous, and your temple service is therefore an abomination that is incapable of atoning for the nation. An opposition high priest of sufficient purity and righteousness, therefore, has to perform the national avodah service for the atonement on Yom haKippurim. Okay, so that's one facet then of Yaakov haTzadiq. He was acting as the high priest, performing Yom at least once, maybe more than once, maybe over more than 1 year. But he was the opposition high priest. Now these groups, this Qumran group, they had a slightly different calendar from the calendar followed by the Perushim, by the Pharisees and the elite Sadducees, or the richer Sadducees. And so maybe the 1 year, the Yom Kippur of a Tzadoqim, of a pure Tzadoqim, was like maybe 3-4 days before, another year, a couple of days after the Yom Kippur, official establishment, Yom haKippurim. So this allowed him to, let's call it, slip into the Holy of Holies and to perform the prayer service over there. Okay, so now we will see that Yaakov haTzadiq was the appointed successor of Jesus. Okay, Eusebius wrote as follows about Yaakov haTzadiq in his history of the church. Then there was Yaakov, who was called the master's brother, for he too was named the son of Joseph. This Yaakov, whom the people of old called haTzadiq, the just, because of his outstanding Tzedaqah righteousness, it's a sense for social justice. Tzedaqah has got a lot of dimensions. For example, if you are well fed and you see a person who is hungry, you will share food with that person. Tzedaqah also means that if here comes a king, and it's a good king, you will greet him in the way that you greet a king. And if here comes the poorest beggar in the country, but also a good guy, you will treat him in the same way. You will not turn your back against him because he's poor and humble. These are facets of Tzedaqah, social justice, and not being a respecter of persons. He was the first, so the records tell us, to be elected to the throne of an overseer of a Jerusalem kahal, of Ebionites, of Evionim, Netzarim, Osei HaTorah, Qana'im. Okay, so let's talk about these terms here. First of all, for background, we must once again emphasize that the movement that later became Gentile Christianity, there's just nothing about that movement that you see over here at this stage. To make a long story short, and we will see it point by point later, is that these Tzadoqim, guys like Yaakov haTzadiq, they began an outreach. They were sending people to different cities all around the Roman Empire to make what is called nilwim. And the nilwim is people who are not born Jewish, they are not, to the best of their knowledge, Israelites genealogically, but they attach themselves to Israel. And they grow in their knowledge of and observance of a Torah without full-blown conversion. Okay, so these are nilwim. Okay, so the door to full conversion was always open, but as an entrance requirement, the person would sort of just basically lead a moral life and not eat meat with like blood dripping out of it. And but he would attach himself to Israel. Okay, so this was the nilwim movement, and they were incorporated into Israel under what is called the laws of a ger toshav, the laws of the foreigner who's going to be in our midst. That is basically what ger toshav means. So these nilwim, these people who sort of joined themselves to Israel, without necessarily converting to the Derech Israel, to the way of Israel, to what is known as Judaism today. They were the Nulwim. Now, this was a thorn in the flesh of the Roman Empire, because this movement was growing and they were aligned with the freedom-loving, with the insurrectionists, with the freedom-loving parties, with the groupings inside the land of Israel, specifically with this group of haTzadiq. And what then happened is that a Herodian prince by the name of Shaul, Paul, the Apostle Paul, he claimed to be in psychic contact with a deceased leader of his movement, Jesus, and he started channeling Jesus, claiming that Jesus is now his Magid, his what we would call a spirit guide. And he started bringing anti-freedom, pro-Roman mystery religion teachings, and then he was energized. He was energized by the spiritual forces that he was in communication with, and with extreme energy, with an extreme level of energy, he sort of like went into the Roman Empire, traveling and working very, very hard to hijack the entire overseas branch of his Nulwim movement, and to move it, to turn it into a mystery religion that was anti-Torah, that would use terms like, but the Torah is legalistic, and would be extremely critical of the Jews, and would call the Jews unbelievers. And basically what this was all about, let's just cut to the essence of it. Paul was Herodian. The Herodians were Edomites. They were descended from Esav. The spirit guide, the entity that Paul contacted was not Jesus, it was the soul of Esau. And Esau was sort of cheated out of his birthright by Yaakov donkeys years ago. And what is now happening is that Esau is taking revenge, and a movement is initiated and energized by Esau, by the Überseele of the Roman Empire, and it becomes an adversarial, alienated brother sort of a religion. It is family, but it is alienated. It is the content of Christian theology is based on the writings of Paul. Paul claims to have made contact with Jesus and to receive messages and instruction from him. That is an identity theft. It was not Jesus, it was Esau, it was Esav, and so on. So that is an essential thing to realize. Okay, so, and also that movement that eventually received the blessing of the Roman authorities. It is not the religion of Yaakov haTzadiq. It is not the way of the original historical Yeshua. It is the religion of Esau. It is originated and started with Esau. Now, if you go back and you look at the psychology of Esau, Esau comes back from the field. He's exhausted. He's thirsty and he's hungry. And he sees his brother made a nice pot of soup, lentil stew. And Esau says, I want it all, I want it now. His mother Rivka, her tent would have been like 400, 500 meters away from there, the kitchen tent. He could have walked there and have had his mother stew, but he's willing to abandon his right of the firstborn, just to be satisfied physically in terms of his hunger and his craving for food now. So Esau He wants it all, he wants it now. Another thing with Asaph, he wants some simple and immediate solutions. So if there's a faith, spiritual path, and the spiritual path tells you that you must pray this 3-minute sinner's prayer or 1-minute sinner's prayer, and now you are saved. That is what you see operating there, is the psychology of Esau. That is the fingerprint of Esau. That is not the fingerprint of Yaakov. Yaakov says that if you want to walk the Mesilat Yesharim, if you want to walk the path of straightness, the straight paths, then you must refine your character. You must work very hard on what is called in Hebrew tikkun hamidot. You've got to work on yourself, and it may take decades, and your works go before you. It's not that you say this 1-minute sinner's prayer and now you are saved, and now you are superior to the other people and they are unsaved, and you are saved because you follow a certain creed. That is the fingerprint of Asaph. That is, Yaakov and Asaph were like twin brothers. They look very similar, but you must look for the finer detail. You must look at the psychology. If it's a quick fix, instant solution that doesn't require of you to sort of like shed tears and work on yourself and improve yourself and make a list of your character traits that are rough and difficult and where you have to work on yourself, but grants you like a superior salvation status just based on saying a sinner's prayer. That is Asaph. That is not Yaakov. You've been hoodwinked. You've been tricked. And the identities have been swapped. And you are on the wrong train. You must get off that train. You must get on the train that requires of you to work on yourself. There's no quick fix religions, and where your works go before you. Okay. So we have Yaakov haTzadiq here. Is a man of extreme righteousness, of a very high level of Tzedaqah, righteousness. And Josephus, he also writes about Yaakov being, he was set apart, he was kadosh from his birth. Everybody from the master's time until our time has called him the Tzaddik, the righteous. And because of his unsurpassable Tzedaqah, righteousness, he was called the righteous and Oblias. And in his works on James, the brother of Jesus, as well as the New Testament Code, Professor Robert Eisenman goes into detail on this matters, and he comes to a solution of understanding terms like Oblias. Okay, so Oblias means bulwark of a people, and righteousness for Epiphanius, it means the wall. For Eusebius, it's protection of a people. It's part of his concept is that a Sadduq, protects the community in which he or she stays. If there's a Sadduq in a community and there is an edict, a decree against that community, it is held back and the harsh judgment does not come over the community if there is a Sadduq inside that group of people. So for that reason, Yaakov haTzadiq acted as a protector of his people. So this protection is not by virtue of him having a private militia. It's by virtue of his devotion and his tzedakah, his social justice, the way that he treats people, the way that he takes the function of the opposition high priest seriously, and he carries the burdens of a people on him, and is willing to risk his life to, as the opposition high priest, go into the Holy of Holies. Okay, so the Syriac Apostolic Constitutions, 2nd century work, says that Jesus personally appointed his brother Yaakov as his successor. Yaakov was a brother of Jesus and the one appointed overseer of assembly in Jerusalem by the Master himself. In his history of the church, Eusebius wrote as follows about the election or appointment of Yaakov haTzadiq as the leader. Yaakov was the first, as the records tell us, to be elected to the throne of overseer of the Jerusalem assembly. In the Gospel of Thomas, one of the Nag Hammadi documents, knowing that Jesus would soon depart from him, his Talmudim, his disciples, his disciplined ones, his students, asked him who would lead them after his departure. His reply was as follows, Logion 12 of the Gospel of Thomas. And Yeshua said to all his disciples, in the place where you are to go to Yaakov haTzadiq, James the righteous, James the just, for whose sake heaven and earth were created. Okay, so the Palestinian bishop Epiphanius, bishop of Salamis, who had access to the works he referred to as Anabatmoi Yakovo, the Ascents of James, as well as the Gospel of the Hebrews, as used by the ancient Jewish followers of Jesus, called the Evionim, or the Poor. The Gospel of the Hebrews was also known to Jerome and to others. Both of these Ebionite manuscripts are lost. Bishop Epiphanius said that the Anabatmoi Yakobo dealt with the discourses that James gave from the steps of the temple to the people of Jerusalem, and says that Yaakov was the first to whom the Master Jesus entrusted his throne upon earth. Okay, so what this is that there were evil outsiders, foreigners, colonial powers ruled over Israel. And the scummy, powerful local family of non-Israelites, basically of descendants of Esau, Herodians, with whom they cooperated and who were their puppet rulers. These were the Herodians. And so the freedom groups, the freedom parties, the people who were Qana'im for liberty, who were passionate ones, zealots for liberty, they said this is a terrible situation. And so from amongst the Qana'im there arose movements, like, for example, where you have a family with Davidic roots, and they declare themselves in a sense to be like a shadow government. And then they believe, they have faith that if they live in a very high state of purity, then that a heavenly army of angels would be sent to assist with the liberation. So some of these liberation movements, groupings, they would have dreamed of arming themselves to the teeth. But what makes this movement that we are talking about different is that it's not a conventional insurrection movement. It's a movement that's sort of saying that 95% of the fighting is going to be done by tzava of malachim, by an army of angels that will come from another dimension, what people just loosely call heaven, and that will do the fighting. So that was the apocalyptic worldview of that day, and that is worldview that was discouraged afterwards, because it led to a tremendous loss of life. It led to the war of 68 to 73. It led to the Bar Kokhba rebellion. All of these groups were apocalyptic revolutionaries. And after the end, there was just massive destruction and tremendous worth of life, and hundreds of thousands of people into slavery. Jerusalem was plowed. It was renamed Aela Capitolina, and where the temple was, there was now a temple to Zeus. And so the cost of this resistance movement was terrible. And so finally, after the year 136, the Pharisees took very firm control. Pharisees should be seen as a political movement saying, let's go operate with the Romans. If we take up the sword, we're going to be beaten. Basically, the Pharisees said that the time for liberation, the time for the final redemption is not right. It is not ripe. If you fight now, you're going to lose, and the loss to the nation will be immense, in the sense that, the temple will be destroyed, and there's going to be like just millions of corpses and so on. So one can understand the position of the Pharisees, but also these insurrectionists, these apocalyptic revolutionaries, they didn't have a lot of respect for the Pharisees. They would call them by names like the seekers after smooth things. They would see them as compromising collaborators who freely collaborated with evil enemies and so forth. By the dating of the rulership of Herod the Terrible, and by the lives of, for example, Hillel and Shammai, two fairly famous Pharisee rulers, one can figure out that they were the chief rabbi, so to speak, during the reign of Herod the Terrible. And they were the guys who said, this guy, if you try to fight against Herod the Terrible, you will be dead. Collaborate with him, do not fight. So, in a sense, the Pharisees were not traitors. They were a party that sort of said that the time is not ripe. They were the disciples of Jeremiah. They were the followers of Jeremiah. They followed the creed of Jeremiah that you see operating in the book of Jeremiah, where Jeremiah says, don't fight. Don't fight against the king of Babylon. You will be crushed. In the end of days, Babylon will fall. That is Jeremiah chapters 50 and 51. Babylon is going to fall. But don't take up your arms now. The time is not yet ripe. So that was the Pharisees. So let us give them the respect that they deserve, even though they were not accepted by these insurrection zealot movement parties. Okay, so Jerome says that Yaakov ruled the Kahal, the assembly in Jerusalem, for 30 years, until the 7th year of Nero. So in other words, if he was, okay, the 7th year of Nero, of Caesar Nero, was the year 62. So that is when Yaakov haTzadiq would be killed, when his judicial murder took place. Okay, so Jerome then implicitly dates Yaakov's rule from about the year 30-32, reaffirming indirectly that Yaakov's succession of Jesus was immediate, and it was a direct appointment and maybe also an election. In the recognitions of Clement, we read that Yaakov haTzadiq was an esteemed and capable leader. The assembly was constituted in Jerusalem, was most plentifully multiplied, and grew, being governed with the most righteous ordinances by Yaakov haTzadiq, James the Just. Okay, let us stop this guy now and conclude the session. Let me just quit here. Okay, and let us go to sorry about that. Let us go here, and let me just look for the keyword, find the keyword voodoo. Okay, so what I want us to do now is to open Acts 1:23. So let us go to Bible. Okay. Lectures like these are given off a cuff. I'm not preparing much of a script. And so let's just wait. Why is this? Okay, there we come. Let's go to open the Bible. and open the New King James Version. Irritatingly, it opens in strange stuff. 123. Okay, so the scene in Acts 1 is basically Jesus is dead. And now there's a problem of succession. And of course, the leader is gone. Now, who must be appointed now? It's the new leader. And all these classical sources tell us that the new leader is Yaakov haTzadiq, James the Just. But this author here of Acts, okay, one of the themes that will come out, and some of the videos could be called and grouped under the following heading. This may sound strange, but this is what it's all about. The heading is the first chapters of a book of Acts as a stabbing spree, as an attack, a demented stabbing spree against the family of Jesus. Okay, so what we've got is Jesus is gone. There's a need for a new leader, and all the classical sources tell us that there was an election, or there was an appointing on the part of Jesus, and the person who was appointed to take over as the leadership is Yaakov haTzadiq. Indeed, in Acts 14:15, we see that Yaakov is the leader. There is like the council, and he is the Nasi, he is the leader. But where is his appointment? So the author of Acts, this is counter-insurrection, psychological warfare against the Jesus movement. He is telling us that the immediate concern was, oops, we used to be 12, but now one is gone. It's Judas is gone. He was the betrayer. That's probably a complete fabrication. With the aim of instilling anti-Semitism, because Yehuda means Jew, and it's a fabrication. It's a malicious fabrication. All the stories about the death of Judas Iscariot is weird stories with strange elements, and it's not the same story. And so the whole picture here is that, oops, we used to be 12, now we're 11. We can't handle being 11, we want to be 12. And so immediately, in the place of this Judas, there's a new guy being elected. Okay, the methodology of this author of this psychological warfare against the Jesus movement and the family of Jesus, after his death, his family took over. The first family member to rule was Yaakov haTzadiq. After his murder, Shimon, also known as Kepha. Kepha is not Peter, Kepha is Shimon. It's the nickname of the other brother. He was the ruler. And then more from the same family. These rulers were called the desposenoi, the family members. So you have a similar situation in Islam. After the death of Rasul Muhammad, there was a fight. Who's going to be the leader? And there was like the Ali movement, or the movement centered with the Shiat Ali, the party of Ali. And they said that the family, Ali and Fatima, they are from the companions of a prophet, they are the people who must rule. It must be from the family. And then there was the other faction, the Abu Bakr, the more Sunni faction, and they said no. It's not from the family. It's a person who's elected and a revered leader. Okay, so there was little love lost between these factions, and there was bitter fighting between the Shia to Ali, the Shiites, and the Sunni faction in Islam. So what we've got here, if you look at the events in the case of Jesus, is that the prophet is now not there anymore. He's dead. And now what we've got now is that the companions of a prophet, there's now a question. which of the companions of a prophet must now be the leader? And here is a very strong tradition, and all the ancient sources says that Yaakov haTzadiq was the leader. But in the book of Acts, it's psychological warfare, psy-war, against the Jesus family. And they come up now with a story is that there's an election because we can't handle being 11, we want to be 12. What nonsense is that? If your leader is gone, you want a new person to be the leader. You don't want to fill a gap amongst the followers. This is like, we are not gullible. This is like nonsense that we are being fed. Okay, so what is being told here in the psychological warfare against the Jesus family is that there's an election to fill the missing disciple, and that there are two candidates, Matthias, who's a tax collector, and then another guy called Joseph, called Barsabbas, who was surnamed Justice. Okay, and that this Joseph, called Barsabbas, who was surnamed Justice, was then the loser, and that Matthias, Matthew, the tax collector, that he was the winner. Now, what on earth is going on here? First of all, the Herodians were tax collectors. The family of the Herodians were tax collectors. Paul was basically from a family of tax collectors. The most hated people were detested in Israel at that stage were the tax collectors. They were the impimpis, they were the collaborators, they were the people who sort of like they were the traitors. So tax collector means a freely collaborating with the oppressors, with the pagans, with the Herodians, with their unauthorized divorces and their first cousin marriages. That is what the term tax collector means. It's psychological warfare. It is like mockery of freedom movement. Okay, so what? Let's look further. Let us look further and look for the term voodoo. Okay, so what we've got at this stage is that many reliable, independent early sources testify that the entire Jesus movement were daily immersers. A daily immerser is a Sabba, a Sabian. This practice was called by the church fathers, Hebrew Baptists, the daily immersers. A daily immerser was referred to as a Bar Sabba. Okay, so a person who immerses himself every day. In the Clementine literature, Peter is a daily immerser. He immerses himself, he wears white linen clothing, and he immerses himself every day at sunrise in cold water. He is a Bar Sabba. Okay, so this whole family were Bar Sabbas. They were daily immersers. Yaakov, the brother of Jesus, can be called Yaakov Bar Yosef. One of the several of the church fathers calls him is also the son of Joseph. Yaakov Bar Yosef. He was also known as Yaakov haTzadiq. The Latin for Tzaddik is justice. Now we must know that there's an old form of witchcraft, your old classical witchcraft of human societies, whether it's Iceland or Norway or Africa or wherever in the world, your classical old school witchcraft is imitative magic, voodoo. For example, in Tibet, if there was an enemy, then the guy who felt threatened by a certain perceived enemy, he would write the enemy's name on a piece of paper or whatever, writing material, parchment, and he would put it in his boot under his feet. And as he was walking the whole day, he would like tread on his enemy. So that is imitative magic. You're sort of like imitating the act of treading on the names of your enemies. So this is voodoo. And an often used witchcraft technique is to write the names of hated opponents backwards. The name Daniel, for example, is brought to nothing and destroyed by writing it in a reverse letter sequence as Leinat. This is Daniel subjected to witchcraft, and in this witchcraft of linguistic voodoo, Daniel is written as Leinat. Now look very carefully at Acts 1:23. The redactors of this pro-Pauline, let's just call it not Pauline, but let's call it this pro-Pauline propaganda document, which is psychological warfare against the Jesus family, willfully staged a cunning unhistorical drama in which Joseph Bar Saba, surname Justice, is the miserable loser in an election, while a character who is a tax collector, an obedient Herodian collaborator and commendable agent of a Roman Herodian tax farming oppressor regime and colonialist oppressors, is sarcastically staged as being the winner. The name of a loser, Joseph Bar Saba, surname Justice, is linguistic voodoo for the name of a beloved brother and personally appointed successor of Jesus, the revered Yaakov Bar Yosef haTzadiq. James, the son of Joseph, the daily immerser, the Bar Saba, known as the Tzaddik, Latin for Tzaddik, justice. History is replaced by poetry, but a very malignant poetry, a poetry that is designed to obscure and to mock. So one can put it like this. The history is, let's just center it a little bit. Okay, the history is that there was Yaakov Bar Yosef haTzadiq. The malignant poetry, the linguistic voodoo, is Joseph Bar Saba, surname Justice. Joseph, the daily immerser, nicknamed Justice. In Hebrew, that Justice is Tzaddik. So it is a disguised form of a name of Yaakov haTzadiq is flipped around in linguistic voodoo so that you can bring it to nothingness. It's a way of telling the family of Jesus that you've lost the war. You have now been displaced. You've lost your power. Your movement has been hijacked. You can't do anything about it. The tax collectors and the Herodians, the collaborators, they've taken hold, they've grabbed the steering wheel of your movement. They've stolen names like Jesus, but the movement has been hijacked. And this is mockery. It is psychological warfare, and it is linguistic voodoo. It's witchcraft. It's a witchcraft method to mock and to sort of say that your movement is out of your hands. It's been hijacked. It's been taken over by evil men, and so on. Okay, so what happens now 300, 400, 500, 600 years later is that this original movement, they had Gentile converts, the Nilwim, and these were aligned and they cleaved in love and support to the freedom-loving, Torah-observant part of Israel. In the hijacked form, it's now madness. It is a hijacked movement. They are inventing theology, where they sort of take 1% of Judean messianism, but completely distort it, and they sort of like unify that with mid-Platonism, Neo-Platonism, concepts like homoousia. They come up with like doctrines of a Trinity, which are idolatrous in nature. It's shituf. Shituf is a type of idolatry where you say that God has got a partner, and that you can pray to a partner, and that there's some sort of a partnership. This is shituf. It's a light duty idolatry in a sense, of type shituf. But the worst thing is that this movement is now imbued with what Esav, the Uberziele of Edom Rome, wants. He wants for himself and for his followers to have a superiority complex. All the years, Edom was subservient to Israel. And the Edomites, who sort of became the Herodian rulers, yes, they had the power, but in terms of religion, they still had this inferiority complex. They didn't really fit in, and they didn't really belong, and they found the Torah a little bit of an irritant, and it was like a high standard that they couldn't meet, and they were always like wayward, always choosing the path of immorality or just easy solutions. And in Christianity, in Pauline Christianity, they found the ideal religion. It gives them, as Edomites, as Herodians, a superiority complex over and against the Jews. It relieves them from their inferiority complex. Now they are the saved ones, and the Jews are unsaved, and so forth. So it gives them a lot of like perceived superiority, even though it's still inferior. It's shituf, it's idolatry. It carries the psychopathology of Esav, of Edom, all over it, and it is, all the material, all the gospel materials are largely anti-Jesus movement, anti-insurrectionist, pacifying, psychological warfare, and the specific people who are under the most fire would be Yaakov haTzadiq, as well as his successor, Simeon bar Klofa, also known as Kepha. Simeon bar Klofa, or nicknamed Kepha. And specifically there in this gospel material, a literary figure, especially in Luke Acts, a literary figure is brought up and empowered, and is the guy called Peter. And the objective of all the high position and all the speeches made by Peter is basically to it's just to basically say anti-Jewish things, and to say that you have killed the Master, you have killed the Lord, and so forth. Is to get him to say these things, but it's also to obscure, not so much Yaakov, it's to obscure the leadership position of Yaakov haTzadiq, and also to obscure and to paint out of a picture the other Simeons. Simon Peter, the historical person behind that is Shimon bar Yonah. But there's another Simon, the hated. The followers of Paul hated him. And he's the persona non grata is Simeon bar Klofa. And so this other Simeon is pushed out of the picture by building up a picture in Luke Acts specifically of Peter, and putting then this Simon Peter in a position of leadership, which he never had. He was at most a traveling inspector of certain overseas communities who reported to Yaakov haTzadiq, who reported to James. But he is now made into this a bit of an anti-Jewish figure who sort of in Acts 2 3 times in a row says that you have the blood libel, you have killed Jesus. It was the Romans who killed him, because there was he got on the wrong side of the law. He and his followers took control of Temple Mountain. They threw out Sadducees out of the temple, and they cleaned out the temple compound. And they put armed guards at the entrances to the temple, and for this he was killed. And he was seen as a lestis, as lestai. He was seen as a bandit. He was seen as a terrorist, basically, as a threat for state security, and that is it. So he was killed by the Romans. But this Peter guy, this construct, this literary construct called Peter, in Acts 2 he said that you Jews, you have killed the master. And no, it was the Romans, and he got on the wrong side of Roman law, and he was seen as a danger to Roman state security and Roman interests. He was seen as a danger to the stability of this Roman province, this colony of the imperial power of Rome. Of course, there was the Roman collaborationist parties, the elite establishment Sadducees, as well as many from the Pharisees. They were Roman collaborationists. They didn't like these sort of like more violent types. They called them by names of, what is it again? Can't hit upon the name now. The Biryon, something like Biryonim. They're seen as violent types. So the peace parties, the establishment Sadducees, as well as the Pharisees, the Roman collaborationist parties, they also didn't like these radicals, Qana'im. Okay, so this is to show you that there's linguistic voodoo against the brother and successor of Jesus, haTzadiq, operating in the first chapter of the book of Acts. A part of history is obliterated, and it is namely the appointment and the election of haTzadiq as the new leader. It is just completely wiped off the table, and it is replaced by a garbage nonsense account that mocks him by spelling his name in linguistic voodoo backwards. So this is something that shows you, if you take this to heart, it tells you that any attitude that sees the New Testament as word by word, divinely inspired word of God is dangerous. The only ethical approach that we can take to these books is a historical critical approach. A fundamentalist reading is going to sort of like make you sit on the lap of a Satan the rest of your life. You must become a critical reader so that you can get out of the domain of impurity and out of the domain of lies. A Navi shaker is a false prophet. This is Olam shaker. If you have a fundamentalistic reading of the text of the New Testament, you miss the fact that it is psychological warfare against the movement and the family of Jesus. It's pacification literature, and it's insurrection calming pacification literature. There's a professor at Ohio State University, a professor of astrophysics, and in his summary of books on dealing with the historical analysis of the Jesus movement, he says that the New Testament is not a precipitated oral tradition. It is psychological warfare against the movement of Jesus, haTzadiq, Shimon bar Klofa. Okay, so this is it. It has implications for our lives, our choices. What I see very often is there's people who hear this, but they are afraid of their husband, they are afraid of their wife, and they are afraid of their social system in which they have been born into, and they just sort of like in a very cowardly fashion just sit in the corner, and they don't want to know about it, and they don't want to think about it. No, don't approach this as a coward. Study this, see it. We are going to do a lot of videos and in which we're going to show this over and over and over again from a lot of angles. And this is it. So all of the best to you. Now is the time to sort of like study things and to not be meek and not be stuck in the club in which you were born and in which you move, but to be brave and be decisive. Thank you very much. Goodbye.